I think we'll get started, folks. Thank you all for coming. Can you all hear me? Appreciate it. My name is Gery Plourde. I'm from Detroit. The only reason that's relevant is I've spent a lot of my career primarily helping the domestic automakers within their supply chain. And so I hope to share some of the insights that I've learned. I've been on a vendor side in terms of helping them and other companies, and also as a consultant. And supply chain resiliency is something that in that business, anybody in the auto business here, manufacturing? Very complex supply chains, lots of different requirements, particularly around quality going out into the supply chain, lots of connectivity issues, and so we'll talk about some of the approaches that I've learned over my experience working with them in terms of improving supply chain resiliency. I listed some of the projects that I've worked on, and I'll talk about a little bit of those going through this, and we'll touch on some of those and use some of those as examples when we talk about some of the ways to improve resiliency within your supply chains. The first one was probably the biggest and longest project I worked on. It was with one of the domestic automakers, automating the onboarding of their supply chain. If you think of a major automotive manufacturer, they have literally tens of thousands of supplier organizations, and then across those companies, you have users from every part of their organization that may need to interact with the domestic automaker. So the project that we worked on essentially automated the onboarding and collaboration across that complex supply chain. Prior to that automaker spent millions trying to connect to the supply base, upwards of 30 different administrators within their organization doing nothing but onboarding organizations, onboarding users, and so forth. So the first thing we did was automate the ability and deployed self-service for those suppliers to automate themselves. Still a lot of work that has to be done internally inside the automaker, but the ability to automate the onboarding delivered a lot of value for them. And even today, they're using the collaboration engine within that solution to communicate out to the supply base in an automated way. Prior to doing that, they were using what most people use, email. And if you're in a position where you're trying to connect and collaborate with your supply chain and communicate, and you're using email, you will spend endless amounts of time trying to keep those email lists up to date. Because how do you know in an organization when somebody leaves that organization and some new person comes in? You don't. And so by deploying self-service and letting the suppliers manage that themselves, it naturally keeps itself updated. So I'll talk a little bit about that particular project. We also worked with one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in terms of the small market distribution and order management. They handled the distribution for the major markets, but in smaller market, they used non-company distributors. So they had a lack of visibility into everything those distributors were doing. We deployed a solution for the pharmaceutical to have visibility, not just within the distribution that they were doing in the major markets, but also the distribution that their third-party partners were responsible for. Third project was around, with a tier one automotive supplier, was around automating inventory fulfillment. The problem they were trying to address was, in the automotive business, most of you all know that it's all just-in-time inventory. There is no parts anywhere anymore. And so it places a higher level of importance and criticality on the supply chain. Parts have to be there when they need them. And so the tier one automotive supplier needed a proactive inventory replenishment so that from their downstream so that they could support the automakers in the just-in-time world. A little bit of a different project around automotive parts retailer. Didn't really specifically impact the supply chain, but peripherally and maybe downstream, we worked with a retailer to increase online commerce through understanding what their customers were doing online, and we delivered a solution around buyer behavior. Essentially, the whole goal of was to increase their online commerce. One of the projects I'm heavily involved in currently, that same automaker under the first example is now looking to do the same type of onboarding and collaboration with what they call level 2 through 4 suppliers. So if you think of an automotive supplier, they have level 1 suppliers which they directly interact with. Many of those companies are $25, $30 billion companies themselves with complex supply chains and networks. The level 2 through level 4, as they call it, are the suppliers that serve their level 1 suppliers. Historically, they've had little to no visibility into level 2 through 4, if you will, and we're helping that same automaker increase the ability to understand things impacting in the supply chain at the level 2 through level 4 stages, if you will. So, any questions on that? These are just some of the supply chain projects I've been involved in. One of the things I would mention, because I've been involved in projects that haven't gone well as well, for particular, again, particularly in the automotive business where I'm from, but I highlighted the areas in blue because it sounds obvious, but it's easier said than done, is when you deploy a project or when you take on a project to increase value for your organization in the supply chain, and you're trying to address a specific need, that keeps everybody focused. We all know what the goal is, and it has a much better level of success in terms of delivering the expected value. Higher level of success with specific goals in mind. In your worlds, I would suggest my experience is unbelievable amount of challenges. You have all of the things that you all have to face on the right, things like digital transportation, modernizing your technical investments, responding to ESG regulations. In our world, in Europe particularly, we're seeing a lot of new e-invoicing mandates by country. Just a real long host of challenges that you're all, just in terms of keeping the supply chain working, lots of challenges on the right. On the left, depending on your organization, those things can impact your ability to execute across the supply chain effectively. We worked with one customer who, a lot of their suppliers were in Ukraine, and so they had to know any time that there was an impact with the conflict there, they needed a proactive notification of that. It could be something very small that you deploy in that situation, but a lot of macro events now are the information that you can obtain in order to understand how that might impact your supply chain is quite substantial. One of the things we've done, for example, is we regularly now, if our customers are tracking shipments across long geographic swaths, if you will, we'll take weather data in and cross-reference that with the pattern of the shipment, for example. Why do we do that? Because if the weather is going to impact, one automaker told us, if you can give us 24 hours notice that a weather event is going to impact shipment, we can go get the parts elsewhere so we don't impact production. So we're down to that level of tracking and monitoring. Many of those types of macro events are available via various news and weather information, and there's ways to take that information and understand how that may impact your supply chain, and we'll talk about some of that as we go through some of the examples. But a lot of challenges within supply chain. I don't envy a lot of the folks that are managing these supply chains and have to keep them up and running, all at a time when you're being asked to do more with less as well, right? So the challenge never gets easier. Okay, Gartner did a report. I actually read this report. I don't know. You guys use Gartner? Who uses Gartner reports? This report is actually quite good. It's around maturing your supply chain and how that impacts the ability to be resilient. And I'm going to read their definition from this report on ecosystem collaboration, which is, if you believe the tenets of this report, it's where organizations need to get to improve their resiliency. The definition is connecting suppliers, manufacturers, distributors, retailers, and customers working together seamlessly by sharing information, resources, and expertise to optimize operations, improve efficiency, and create value for all parties involved. Well, if only that were that easy, right? I mean, that's quite a, that is a huge project to do something like that when you talk about all of the disparate entities and organizations that are a part of that definition. I kind of simplify it and say collaborative approach where everyone in the chain contributes to overall success. That's a little bit easier sort of to bite off and chew, if you will. But certainly the ability to share information with the external constituents is something that is a challenge for a lot of organizations, but when it's done right, in our experience, particularly my experience in automotive, improves substantially. Another example I can share with you in that space is one of the domestic automakers went through an extensive quality improvement process for making their vehicles. If you think of an automaker, right, they're compared in the marketplace with the level of quality in their vehicles. They don't really make any money anymore unless they can keep a buyer who turns in a vehicle and buys the same make and model, or same make, if you will. Their whole thing, it's almost like your cell phones. It's churn. Moving away from an automaker loses a lot of money. One of the aspects they know in terms of keeping repeat customers, obviously, is quality. So when we talk about something in the supply chain impacting something like that, this particular automaker deployed top to bottom across the entire supply chain a quality management system, quality improvement, not just for the vehicles they made, but they expected and demanded the same quality metrics from all of their suppliers downstream. That's an example of enabling information across their supply chain to impact their ability to improve business results. That's, to me, that's more like what ecosystem collaboration is. It's specific use cases that deploy something that's important to the business that you're in. How many people here are deploying some type of, so this was a Reuters analysis, if you will, or survey. How many people are deploying supply chain visibility solutions? How many people are considering doing it? This particular survey found that almost 3 out of 4 respondents are delivering some or investing in some type of supply chain monitoring, tracking, and visibility. That's quite a high number. For as much market sort of buzz around AI, you see AI at the bottom, right? Why is that? Supply chains are very complex. They're more complex than systems or applications that are serving other parts of your respective businesses, right? They go out farther. They have more of an urgent need to run. And so just the ability to monitor and track is really important. Analytics, whether you're using freeware, business intelligence reporting, that's another big one. Also, almost 1 out of 2 respondents to this survey are doing some sort of analytics against your supply chain data and or forecasting around demand, right? So the number one priority becomes data sharing and communication, according to this report from Reuters, to increase and improve supply chain resilience. Anybody have any thoughts on this? Questions? Okay. So, while those investments are being made, at the same time, we have almost 3 out of 4 supply chain officers saying their technology investments haven't fully delivered expected results, and 1 out of 10 says their investment strategy fully meets the needs of their supply chain. So there's a bit of a dichotomy. There's some investments going on, and yet they don't think that in these surveys that the results are fully being achieved. In terms of what's holding back the success, right? In our experience, and there was a report by a different report from Gartner that talks about the common thread among supply chain projects and what's important and how to broker data to the right people at the right time. This was also backed by a report from Accenture, their supply chain business, that essentially found similar results. Availability of data, really an important thing. How are you going to fix something if you don't have the information of what's important? In the quality example that I used with respect to quality management, the automaker actually enforced downstream they didn't enforce quality technology solutions for their suppliers. They deployed a certain quality process they expected all of their suppliers to follow. And so the data that the suppliers presented back to the automaker could be in any form they wanted, but it had to follow the certain process that automaker expected. Lack of cross-functional data visibility. This is a big one. Access to data. If you think about all the players within your organizations, as well as the suppliers that are serving your companies, access to data, whether it's quality information, shipment information, whatever it might be. In my experience, our customers really struggle with brokering the right information to the right people at the right time. Most of you have good people in your organizations. If there's a problem they need to respond to, they know how to resolve it quickly in their little area of expertise. The issue is getting them the information as quickly and early as possible so that they can respond to it in their little world of expertise, if you will. I'll use a term here generically on the next couple of slides called command center. There's products called command center. I'm not suggesting you need to deploy a command center. To me, a command center is an understanding of who needs information, how quickly, what information do they need, and how do we get it to them. So that whatever it is in the supply chain that may impact the overall execution of the supply chain, those people who need the info have it as quickly as possible. And then lastly, this is a pretty common one, quality of data. Quite honestly, there's a lot of organizations that have old systems, particularly in supply chain. I'm not suggesting you need to modernize it all. I think there's a place for that. But when it comes to quality of data, one of the big things that I've advised organizations, particularly in manufacturing, is look for ways to take unstructured data and make that more structured. So information that's going across and back and forth from the automaker to the supply base through email, that's data that goes from one person to another, and it doesn't really find a value for any other people. Yet there's a lot of data, a lot of value in that data. So how do we take that? And to me, that's more an example of garbage, because it's not something that can be leveraged across the organizations that need access to it. If we go a step further around data and analyze where do we have data challenges, that 5% number is actually quite alarming. It's an obvious statement to make. I'll start in the middle of this particular slide. Integration platforms are critical for supply chains, right? Most of you, how many people do EDI, right? Those systems have probably been in place for years and years and years and years. There's a level of information that is shared across the supply base outside of the EDI integration platform. And so ultimately, the ability to improve supply chain resilience, a lot of it will depend on the ability to integrate with your suppliers, not just EDI, but other forms of collaboration, right? Application to application integration, which when it's done right, automates a lot of the things that people need across their supply base. At the top level, we've seen this problem even today in many organizations that we work with is on the supply side, they have multiple solutions or portals that their customer, if you will, in the example I've been using, the automaker provides them. And what ends up happening is the supply base doesn't know where to go to interact with the organization. One of the biggest things I talked about, and in my experience, because we've solved this for several of them, is the ability to onboard new suppliers is a real challenge. We worked with one organization recently in the manufacturing space. When they have a new supplier, it takes them 6 months to onboard the supplier before they can even leverage the particular parts or service from the supplier. Very inefficient, very costly. That's, I would suggest, one of the big areas of potential value is to automate the ability to onboard new suppliers. There's a certain amount of EDI connectivity that goes in with that and other things, but the more you can automate and move out self-service to the supply base, the more efficient it will be in the shorter time it'll take to onboard them. And I mentioned also, we still see a lot of high degree of unstructured information, data shared in email, in various paper, what have you. The lack of secure file exchange is another area that you'd be surprised. In a lot of organizations, they don't have that ability. That's something, again, that you can bring self-service to. So if you as a customer need your suppliers to provide secure documents, automate that, make them aware that they have to provide that information, put it on them. They're obviously motivated to work with you because you are their customer, right? And so by deploying those types of solutions to make it easier for you, put it on them to share those documents and upload what it is that you need from them and so forth. So from a data standpoint, it's interesting because a lot of the data is there in various systems. It's just getting the data to the right people is a real challenge. So where do we start? I get that question a lot. And particularly in auto, where they're always challenged with very limited budgets. They try to boil the ocean, improve in a lot of different areas. I can tell you that the bottom line statement there, it sounds simple, but most of your systems that you have in place already have the data that you need in order to become more resilient. The issue is, how do we coordinate that data and how do we prioritize the most urgent events to deploy notifications for early warning? I'll give you an example. We worked with a 3PL who was looking to, we worked with an automaker who used a 3PL for most of shipments to the factories, the actual end factory, which is the facilities that are actually building the cars. And what they wanted was an early notice from the 3PLs and carriers combined with weather data, and the example I used earlier, to track all shipments. The goal was, if you can give us 24 hours notice that something may be delayed, we know where to go elsewhere to get the parts, right? They were totally reactive. In the just-in-time world, if the parts don't get there, they stop the assembly line, right? So this becomes a pretty critical activity. The data is already there. You know what you've ordered from your suppliers. You know who the carriers are. And there's publicly available weather services that you can coordinate, if you will, and superimpose over shipment routes, for example, to do some early warning system, right? So this concept of quote-unquote command center, and again, I'm not suggesting you go out and buy a command center solution. What a command center does in that example, it takes that information from multiple sources, combines it together, and does some sort of intelligence against it that makes sense for your organization. That's an easy example of saying, we're going to track all of our shipments to the end factories. We're going to, in that example also, the carriers, most of the carriers had APIs, which makes it really easy to make calls to those carriers to get more of a real-time view of where the shipments are. Early warning, critical, whether the shipments, if it may not be weather related, maybe the truck broke down. Prior to having something like that in place, if a truck broke down, unless the driver notified people, shipment's not getting there, no one's going to know about it. So the concept, you hear a lot in the marketplace about command center. To me, a command center is the ability to take information from multiple sources that you likely already have and combine that information to provide business value, right? Make sense? You can do that with what you have in place today. We worked with a tier 1 automotive supplier. They had a very mature IT operations facility, sort of keeping the lights on internally in their organization. That facility had an ability to do what I would call event management, alert management, right? They had systems in place that if problems arose, it knew who to call and contact and provide what information so that remediation can occur. To me, that's the tenets of a command center. So what we did with them was we pushed the right information. There was a rules engine as part of that, right? To sort of amalgamate the data together, if you will, but we used current systems in place for the notification, the alerting, the routing, and the reporting that had to occur. All those systems were already in place, and it was just a matter of taking data from multiple sources, providing value to the people underneath so that the resiliency, one event avoided translates to, in the automotive world, I can tell you, translates to millions of dollars of savings. Even with the tier 1 autos, which run their businesses very similar to the OEMs, in the just-in-time world, because they've adapted that as well, it can be just as important. Pharmaceutical world, very similar, particularly the one that we worked with. Just the ability for the pharmaceutical company to understand the level 2 distributors. They could, prior to us providing a solution for them, they would get notified in the small markets of pharmacy products not being delivered on time from their customer, which, as you can imagine, was quite embarrassing. So just with the systems they had, the ability to coordinate the information and provide early warning to the various constituents, provided our customer, the pharmaceutical company, with a proactive ability to know that shipments were arriving on time in the small markets, and provided the right people with information when shipments or product wasn't getting there and why, okay? So again, to me, a command center is the ability to coordinate information from multiple areas to provide value to understand what people need to respond to quickly in the supply chain to make it more resilient. Yes, there's business intelligence and more strategic things that should be happening, but in my experience, the ability to prioritize the most urgent events that impact your business and deploy notifications for early warning. If you do nothing else, I can tell you, in terms of resiliency, the projects that I've worked on, if you can get that part right, you're halfway there. You can respond to what reports people need or what information people need on a regular basis, but that does more than probably anything else that I've seen in the marketplace, and you don't need new tooling to do it. You have the data. It's a matter of understanding what those conditions are and how do we remediate them, okay? As you mature, and a common theme that you'll hear from me, just only because my experience, admittedly, is more in automotive, where they have such a complex supply chain and lots of suppliers, is to automate as much as you can so that those people, those suppliers, can be responsible for keeping their organization and their users roped in, if you will. Does everybody know what I mean by that, by onboarding? Okay. Typically, when you onboard new suppliers, you have the organization that needs to be vetted, you have integrations that need to occur to your back-end system, SAP or numerous systems, and you have access to information that the supplier needs in some way or another. Could be as simple as accounts payable or receivable or product design for one of the automakers in Europe. They don't do their own product design anymore. That is done by their design suppliers, and so they share product design documents securely through systems that we've provided. But the suppliers are responsible for onboarding themselves, onboarding their users, and then the right access based on who needs access to is approved by folks in the organization. So it's not fully automated. You typically want to make the supplier responsible for onboarding, but you reserve the right to approve whatever it is that you would approve. Product design documents, for example, are pretty important, right? A person has to have a specific role and be vetted in order to do something like that, okay? So, concept of command center, again, I'm using the command center term very loosely. I don't think of it as a software product or technology solution. I think of it as an enterprise supply chain data and event broker. To me, organizations that have started with the concept of a control tower, which if anyone's deployed a control tower, you're really kind of focused on monitoring shipments. As you mature into a command center, I think the difference is command center understands information and integrates from multiple places and also sends the data and or conditions in the supply chain to multiple people, to the right people at the right time so that they can remediate. Most organizations I've worked with already have a lot of the tenets to be able to do this. Yes, there's some thinking that has to go into what data needs to be combined to provide value, who needs to remediate when conditions occur, how do we get them the information, and those sorts of things. But most organizations already have those capabilities. If you're able to mature even in one process from the left to the right, your resiliency goes up by an order of magnitude. So, if you're considering a command center, whether it's with current technology or you're going out to the marketplace and you're looking at what's available, I thought I would put this up there. From my experience, the right building blocks of a quote-unquote command center has to have multiple data sources, has to be able to integrate, take in data from multiple sources, not just internally, but from your supply chain as well, from your 3PLs, your carriers, weather data like I talked about, ports. You can get information from the leading ports around the world now. So it has to have an ability to take in multiple data sources. And it should be what I call the event and data hub. If you can centralize your events for everything in the supply chain, the notifications may go to different people, but a centralized ability to understand all of your events in time, it helps you remediate and reduce the number of overall events, which improves your supply chain resiliency. It also becomes your data hub. Data hub is kind of tied in with number 4 there, which is insights. It should have some level of business intelligence and reporting. You can get freeware to do that now. Now, these days, most of your organizations have some sort of BI reporting tool like a Tableau or Oracle or even freeware, business intelligence. It should have some ability to make sense of the data for you. A development library is important. What I mean by that is kind of tied with the piece there in yellow. It should be a modern API architecture. I'm a little bit biased on that. I was a programmer for a lot of years. The API microservice architecture allows for easy future expansion, which if anything in the supply chain, we know there'll always be challenges. There'll always be multiple systems to integrate. There'll always be data from different systems that have to be collected. The more you can do through modern architecture, the cheaper it is in the long run. And then number 5 there is kind of tied with number 1, which is whatever you do from a command center perspective, integration is key. Not just EDI integration, but application to application integration, expectations of getting information from your suppliers. Quality data is a big one in manufacturing in your respective businesses. I'm sure there's other areas that integration of data outside of just an EDI, peer-to-peer, so to speak. Integration is really critical because you're managing multiple disparate organizations, and so integration sort of supports that underneath and gives you the ability to get the information that you need, in some cases from systems that you don't have access to. Questions, comments? Okay, one of the other things, particularly like in the tier 1s that we work with, they tend to want to try to deploy everything because they're so focused on providing service and products to their customers. And again, this sounds obvious, deploy what makes sense for your organization. The applications in the middle of this slide, those are all areas of potential value that you could deploy for your organization. All of them will be different based on your company and what might be important for you. In the easiest example, if you're in the tier 1 and you have to make sure that parts are getting to your assembly lines, if you will, tracking becomes very important, right? In other cases, like in the pharmaceutical example, it was all about integrating to their non-pharmacy company integration distributors. So that became very critical. Deploy what makes sense for you. Trying to accommodate all of those becomes a very large project that people sort of tend to lose sight of what we're actually trying to do here. Anytime I've helped customers in this particular area, focused projects deliver better results. Sounds obvious, really important to prioritize. Prioritize things in the supply chain that you need to know of, that remediate problems. Prioritize overall concepts, if you will, across those, what the slide says, applications, but you'll have a much higher level of success in doing so. The other way to look at it, based on your organization, there are what the slide says is functional areas to mature and improve. If you're a CPG organization, counterfeit goods monitoring and product traceability become very important. Anybody have a Yeti? Yeti has a great name in the marketplace. People love their products. You would be, perhaps I was, and you'd be surprised to know there are counterfeit Yeti products across the globe. If you look at them, they look like a Yeti product. I certainly didn't know that was something, but in the CPG world, that's a big issue. And so we helped Yeti understand where in the geographic parts of the world counterfeit Yeti products. How did we do that? We put a little QR code. We helped Yeti in their actual manufacturing, put a little QR code on the bottom of every Yeti. If any of you have a Yeti cooler or a Yeti cup, look on the bottom of it. There's a little QR code there. When it comes across the assembly line, before it gets packaged to go out to the distributors, it gets scanned. So every product that Yeti ships, the actual Yeti product, has a QR code on it. If somebody calls or if somebody says they have a Yeti and they don't have that QR code, Yeti knows that that's a counterfeit product. They know locations across the world where people are trying to exploit the Yeti name by selling counterfeit products. The other thing as part of that process is product traceability. If you get a Yeti and you've ever bothered to register the product, all you have to do is scan that QR code. Enter a few pieces of information on your phone. Takes about 15 seconds. Your product is registered with Yeti. Other areas, like the obvious ones, supplier risk monitoring, disruption monitoring in the supply base. I talked about quality supplier KPI tracking. So we've worked with some of smaller organizations that look at specific functional areas to improve, and that's not a bad way to go after it as well. Okay. Questions, comments? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question because it's really hard to do. The data particularly respectfully in certain geographies, the data is really hard to get around certain supplier organizations. What I have seen in the manufacturing space is what they start with is publicly available information like Dun & Bradstreet and that sort of thing. That doesn't go across all geographies, but there's a lot of information respective to companies and organizations that can be continually managed from available services such as that. That's where most of the autos start. Excuse me. I've seen some of them also require certain information from the suppliers. This goes back to that collaboration platform, right? They're always interested in providing what it is that you need because you are their customer. I'm talking in the form of an automotive company, right? So what we've told some of the automakers and certainly the tier ones that we work with is require certain information that can be vetted from your particular suppliers. on your collaboration platform. If you make an attempt to try to go after each one of them, you'll never get there. But if you build a collaboration platform and require certain information, they will be very motivated to go push that information out to you so that you can vet whatever it is that you need. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that's been my experience. Okay. Shipment and asset tracking is another one in automotive that we work a lot with our customers on. That takes the form of calls out to carriers, interrogating your EDI for certain information like expected shipment dates and so forth. If it's important enough, maybe you put RFID tags or BLE tags on certain shipments if it's important enough to manage and monitor. We worked with a steel manufacturer to do something of that kind, just because what they ship on is hugely important. The pallets they're not wooden pallets. They're very expensive pallets, and they needed to track those. And so we put an asset tracking system in place for them so that they get their pallets back and don't have to order new ones. But the point being is that going after it from a functional area based on priority is not a bad way to do it, in my experience. So, why do supply chain resiliency? I like this graphic from Tesla. It takes 2,500 parts to build a car, but only one not to, right? We all have in the supply chain world, it's high expectations and very fragile. But the ability to improve resiliency reduces the impact to the business overall and provides more value to the organization. Is it worth the time and effort? If you think of supply chain maturity, most people, and you are all probably work day to day in your supply chain, the people in your organization that aren't doing supply chain work day to day, they think of the top one. How do I reduce external spend? That's the most visible, right? But supply chain maturity delivers unprecedented amount of value to the organization. They're more soft dollars, admittedly, but the ability to increase quality and service leads to customer satisfaction. Optimize inventory levels. If you can get to proactive replenishment, that reduces costs overall. Excessive level of purchasing transaction that reduces labor across your organization. So there's a ton of value drivers outside of just reducing the overall spend that organizations can look at and benefit from over the long term in terms of the ability to mature the supply chain. Investing in supply chain, our experience, there's several areas of maturity, things like visibility, limited visibility to all levels of the network. Probably the second bullet point is the biggest one, particularly in manufacturing, that people are concerned with. How do I go from reacting to problems to more of a proactive and predictive posture? Those events that I talked about earlier, if you can prioritize the ones that impact your ability currently and put remediation in place, you're naturally going from reactive to proactive. There's no perfect panacea, but the ability to put those types of notifications in place goes a long way to improving resiliency across the supply chain. Particularly in manufacturing, this is obviously manufacturing, but just-in-time inventory. By maturing, obviously you balance your supply agreements and inventory management practices. And then the last one, in this particular example, is if your organization has multiple tiers of suppliers, you really can't get to a visibility or beyond your tier ones, if you will, without maturing your supply base. And then the last thing, just based on my experience of working with many organizations, I thought I'd kind of pop up a do's and don'ts. The obvious one, early warning system around due. That will do more than anything to increase the resiliency of your supply chain. If you're embarking on a project with your technology vendors, could be a services type implementator or technology, software solution, whatever it might be, rely on the vendors for value analysis. They are just as incented to understand what the value is for you so that all parties can be successful, right? Our experience when I was on the vendor side, some organizations are a little leery of sharing that information. That information is critical. Everybody should be considered to be on the same team to understand why a project, why would we even take something on? What's the value and how do we communicate that value? Somewhere along the way, somebody's going to say, why are we buying this? Why are we integrating with this services partner, whatever it is? Rely on your vendors to understand the value analysis and put equal effort into your people and your processes. Processes is a big one, particularly and it's a challenge, particularly when you have processes that transcend outside your organization into your supply base. And so maturing the process, forget about the technology, can pay big dividends for you by having consistent, more efficient processes. Talked about data integration. That's always going to be a challenge with organizations that have complex supply chains. And then from one of those earlier slides, you saw a lot of different geographic requirements and so forth. In Europe now, there's different GDPR and so forth. Your IT teams, the ones I've worked with, they almost are all up to date or close to it on what the security policies are that are required across technology solutions. One of the things that we tell customers, you already have systems in place. There will always be areas of technology swap out, if you will. But in most cases, you have systems, TMS systems, EDI, ERP, they're already there, they're already in place. Figure out a way to leverage those rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. The ability to collaborate easily across the supply base. This sounds so simple, but it's really hard to do. If you put a mechanism in place for you to communicate seamlessly, you'll never do it through email, I'll tell you that right now, but if you have a collaboration platform or mechanism in place to push notifications out to the supply base, that saves a ton of time and effort and keeps them involved, and they like it too. Doesn't happen so much anymore, but we've seen, over the years, organizations buying technology solutions thinking that's going to solve all their problems, and it doesn't do it. So I would be leery of adding to your technical debt. And then the last one's obvious, which is trying to boil the ocean and trying to mature all of those areas. You'll probably get stuck in not deliver a whole lot versus a very focused effort. So, thank you. Any other questions or comments? All right, thanks for attending today. Appreciate it very much.